In the annals of war, few stories challenge our understanding of humanity quite like this one. What happens when everything you've been taught about your enemy crumbles in the face of unexpected kindness? When the very people you've been trained to hate become the architects of your comfort? This is an extraordinary account of how captivity became liberation, how prison walls transformed into protective embraces, and how a 65-year-old warrior discovered that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not with weapons, but with preconceptions. The morning Lieutenant Colonel James Chin was captured, he prepared himself to die with honor. At 65, the grizzled veteran had served his country for over 4 decades, his weathered hands bearing the scars of countless battles across 3 different theaters of war. The silver threads woven through his black hair told stories of sleepless nights in foxholes, of decisions that haunted him, and of a loyalty to his nation that ran deeper than blood. But death didn't come that gray October morning, when enemy forces overran his position. Instead came something far more unsettling: mercy. Chin stood with his hands bound behind his back, watching his captors methodically process the wounded prisoners. He felt the familiar weight of military training settling over his shoulders like an old, comfortable coat. Name, rank, serial number. Nothing more. He had memorized the prisoner of war protocols decades ago, had drilled them into younger soldiers countless times. The enemy would try to break him with torture, starvation, psychological warfare, all the brutal tactics he had studied and prepared for. He was ready for hell. He was not ready for what came next. The American naval vessel that would become his floating prison appeared on the horizon like a mirage. Even from a distance, Chin could see it was no ordinary military ship. Where he expected rust and grimness, he saw fresh paint gleaming in the afternoon sun. Where he anticipated cramped, windowless holds, he glimpsed what looked suspiciously like balconies. "Is that really where they're taking us?" whispered Private Morrison, a young soldier from Chen's unit who had been captured alongside him. The kid was barely 22, still had baby fat on his cheeks despite months of military rations. Morrison had been Chen's responsibility, and the colonel felt the familiar ache of failure settling in his chest. "Stay alert, soldier," Chen murmured back, though his own eyes remained fixed on the approaching vessel. Something was wrong with this picture. In 4 decades of military service, he had never seen a prison ship that looked so inviting. As their small transport boat drew closer, details became clearer, and with each passing moment, Chen's confusion deepened. The ship wasn't just well-maintained, it was luxurious. Multiple decks stretched skyward, each fitted with what appeared to be private quarters, complete with windows that actually looked like they opened to catch the sea breeze. Gardens, honest-to-God gardens, sprouted from designated areas on the upper decks, their green leaves a stark contrast to the blue-gray of the ocean. "Colonel," Morrison's voice cracked slightly, "this doesn't look like any prison I've ever imagined." Neither had Chun, and that terrified him more than any torture chamber could have. This deviation from everything he knew, everything he prepared for, left him adrift in uncharted waters. What kind of psychological game were his captors playing? What elaborate mind trick was this? The first American officer to greet them at the gangway was a woman in her 50s. Her uniform crisp, but her manner surprisingly warm. Commander Sarah Martinez had the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, but her eyes held something Chun hadn't expected to find in enemy territory: genuine concern. "Gentlemen, welcome aboard the USS Sanctuary," she said, and Chin noticed she didn't say, "Welcome to your prison. I know this situation is difficult for all of you. My job is to ensure your safety and comfort during your stay with us." Comfort. The word hit Chin like a physical blow. In all his mental preparation for capture, comfort had never entered the equation. As they were escorted through the ship's corridors, Chen's military mind automatically cataloged every detail. These weren't the narrow, oppressive passages he had expected. Instead, the hallways were wide enough for 2 people to walk comfortably side by side, well lit by both artificial lighting and natural sunlight streaming through strategically placed skylights. The walls were painted in calming blues and whites, and, most shocking of all, original artwork hung at regular intervals. "The mess hall serves meals from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m., Commander Martinez was saying as they walked, her tone matter-of-fact. as if she were giving a hotel orientation rather than processing prisoners of war. We accommodate dietary restrictions and religious observances. The library is open 24 hours, and we have both print and digital collections in multiple languages. Chun felt his worldview tilting on its axis. This couldn't be real. This level of consideration, of basic human decency toward captured enemies, contradicted everything he'd been taught about American military doctrine. Where was the intimidation? Where were the interrogation chambers, the psychological pressure tactics? They were shown to their quarters, and Chin had to mentally correct himself because these weren't cells. They were actual rooms. Morrison's jaw dropped as they were led to adjacent accommodations, each featuring a rail bed with clean linens, a writing desk positioned near a window with an ocean view, and a private bathroom that appeared to have been recently renovated. "Dinner is in an hour," Commander Martinez said, checking her watch. "Feel free to rest, freshen up, or explore the common areas. The deck is accessible until 10 p.m. each evening, and we encourage prisoners to maintain their physical fitness routine using our exercise facilities." After she left, Chin sat heavily on his bed, an actual mattress, not a hard cot, and stared out the window at the endless expanse of ocean. For the first time in 43 years of military service, he felt completely untethered from everything he thought he knew about warfare, about enemies, about the very nature of human conflict. Morrison appeared in his doorway, his young face a mask of confusion and fear. "Colonel, what kind of game are they playing?" Chin looked at the kid, really looked at him, and realized that Morrison represented everything Chun had once been: certain, prepared, confident in the clarity of right and wrong, us and them. Now, sitting in this floating contradiction, Chin felt ancient in ways that had nothing to do with his 65 years. "I don't know, son," he admitted, the words heavy with the weight of a lifetime certainty crumbling. "But we're going to find out." As the sun set over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that seemed impossibly beautiful for a prison ship, Chin realized that sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one who tries to break you with force. It's the one who challenges everything you believe about the very nature of the enemy itself. Have you ever had an experience that completely shattered your preconceptions about someone or something? Share your story of unexpected humanity in the comments below, and let's explore how our assumptions about others can be transformed by genuine human connection. The ideology that had shaped James Chen's worldview began forming long before he ever held a rifle. Born in 1958 to parents who had fled their homeland during a brutal civil war, Chen had grown up in military housing where the concepts of duty, honor, and sacrifice weren't just words. They were the pillars that held his family's new life together. His father, General Lu Chun, had been a decorated officer who spoke in absolutes. In war, son, there are only two sides, the elder Chun would say during their evening walks around the base perimeter: those who fight for freedom, and those who seek to destroy it. The Americans understand this. They're our allies because they, like us, value liberty above comfort, principle above convenience. These conversations had occurred during the height of the Cold War, when the world seemed divided into clear moral territories. Young James had absorbed these lessons with the intensity of a child desperate to honor his father's sacrifice. The family's escape from their homeland had cost them everything: wealth, status, extended family, cultural identity. The only thing that remained was their commitment to the principles that had made their refuge possible. The enemy. General Chun had explained one particularly memorable evening as they watched American F-16s practice maneuvers in the distant sky, will always try to appear reasonable, even kind. This is their greatest weapon, not their bombs or their bullets, but their ability to make you forget why you're fighting. Never forget, James, a comfortable prisoner is still a prisoner. These words have been reinforced throughout Chen's military education, where instructors spoke with clinical precision about enemy psychological warfare tactics. American forces, they were taught, were particularly sophisticated in their approach to captured personnel. They would use comfort and apparent kindness to lower psychological defenses, making prisoners more susceptible to interrogation and indoctrination. The Western military doctrine, Professor Wong had explained during Chen's Advanced Strategic Studies course, emphasizes what they call hearts and minds warfare. They believe that by treating captured enemies with apparent respect and comfort, they can achieve two objectives: extract more reliable intelligence, and potentially convert ideological opponents into sympathizers or even collaborators. Chen had taken extensive notes during these lectures, his young mind filing away every detail about American tactics. The floating prison ships, when they were first mentioned in intelligence briefings, had been described as particularly insidious examples of this approach. Unlike traditional POW camps, which relied on obvious deprivation and intimidation, these vessels were designed to create cognitive dissonance in their prisoners. Imagine, Colonel Zhang had said during a classified briefing that Chen still remembered word for word, being prepared for brutality and instead encountering luxury. The psychological impact is profound. Prisoners begin to question not just their treatment, but their fundamental understanding of their captors. This confusion becomes a pathway to manipulation. The strategy was brilliant. Chen had admitted even then. By providing comfort and apparent kindness, American forces could achieve what torture often failed to accomplish. Genuine cooperation born not from fear, but from gratitude and confusion. Throughout his military career, Chen had seen evidence of this approach in various contexts. American diplomatic missions that arrived with humanitarian aid while simultaneously conducting intelligence operations. Cultural exchange programs that seemed innocent but served to identify and cultivate potential assets. Military exercises disguised as disaster relief efforts that allowed for reconnaissance and relationship building with local populations. They are not evil. His father had clarified during one of their last conversations before the old man's death. Do not make the mistake of thinking your enemy is evil. Evil is simple to fight. The Americans are something far more dangerous. They are genuinely convinced of their own righteousness. This makes them capable of acts of both great kindness and great cruelty, often simultaneously, all in service of what they believe to be the greater good. This understanding had shaped Chen's entire worldview. America wasn't a cartoon villain. It was a complex superpower driven by genuine beliefs about freedom, democracy, and human rights. But those very beliefs, Chen had been taught, made them willing to employ any means necessary to achieve their ends. The comfortable prison ship wasn't cruelty disguised as kindness. It was kindness weaponized for strategic purposes. Chen's personal experience had reinforced these lessons. During joint training exercises with American forces in the 1980s, he had been struck by the genuine warmth and professionalism of his counterparts. They had shared meals, exchanged stories about their families, even debated political philosophy late into the evening. But Chen had never forgotten that these same men, should circumstances change, would be his enemies. Their kindness wasn't false. It was simply irrelevant to the larger strategic picture. The tragedy of modern warfare, Chen had come to believe, was that it pitted genuinely good people against each other in service of competing visions of how the world should work. American soldiers weren't monsters. They were patriots serving their country's interests just as Chen served his. But that mutual respect didn't change the fundamental reality that those interests were often incompatible. This philosophical framework had sustained Chen through 4 decades of military service. It explained why American prisoners in his country's custody were treated according to international law, not out of weakness or moral superiority, but because professional military forces understood that today's enemy might be tomorrow's ally, and reputation mattered in the long-term game of geopolitics. It also explained why American forces would house their prisoners in luxury. They weren't being kind for kindness' sake. They were investing in future relationships, demonstrating their values, and potentially cultivating sources of intelligence or influence that might prove valuable years or even decades later. As Chen sat in his comfortable quarters aboard the USS Sanctuary, watching the sunset paint the Pacific in shades of gold, he felt the familiar weight of his training and indoctrination settling around him like armor. Everything he was experiencing, the good food, the comfortable accommodations, the respectful treatment, was exactly what he'd been taught to expect from sophisticated American psychological warfare. The fact that it felt genuine didn't matter. The kindness in Commander Martinez's eyes, the obvious care that had gone into designing these facilities, the apparent respect for prisoners' dignity and cultural needs, all of this could be real and still serve strategic purposes that had nothing to do with humanitarian concern. Chen's challenge wasn't to resist obvious torture or intimidation. His challenge was to maintain his sense of identity and purpose, while surrounded by people who seemed genuinely committed to his comfort and well-being. He had to remember that in the complex chess game of modern geopolitics, sometimes the most dangerous move appeared to be no move at all. The ideology that had shaped him demanded that he view every gesture of kindness through the lens of strategic calculation. It wasn't paranoia, it was professional necessity. And yet, as he prepared for his first dinner aboard this floating contradiction, Chin couldn't shake the feeling that his 43 years of training might not have prepared him for what he was about to encounter. What beliefs about others have shaped your worldview? Take a moment to reflect on the stories you were told growing up about different groups of people. How might those early lessons be influencing your current perceptions? Share your thoughts on how childhood teachings about us versus them continue to impact adult relationships. The mess hall aboard the USS Sanctuary defied every expectation Chin had carefully constructed during his decades of military service. As he and Morrison entered the dining area that first evening, Chen's trained eye immediately began cataloging details that refused to fit into any framework he understood. The space itself was enormous, easily 3 times larger than any military dining facility Chen had ever seen. Natural light streamed through a series of skylights, supplemented by warm LED fixtures that created an almost restaurant-like ambience. Round tables of varying sizes accommodated different group preferences, from solitary diners to larger gatherings, and each table was set with actual cloth napkins and real silverware rather than the plastic utensils Chan had expected. But it was the prisoners themselves who truly shattered Chen's preconceptions. At a table near the windows, an elderly man with a carefully trimmed white beard was engaged in animated conversation with 2 much younger prisoners. All 3 were laughing, genuinely laughing, at something the older man had just said. Their uniforms were clean and pressed, their posture relaxed, their faces bearing none of the hollow desperation Chen associated with captivity. "Colonel Chen?" A voice interrupted his observations. Chen turned to see a man approaching, perhaps 50 years old, with the bearing of a career military officer despite wearing the same prisoner uniform as everyone else. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Park, Korean People's Army. I heard we had a senior officer joining us today." Chen accepted Park's offer handshake, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact. "How long have you been aboard?" 8 months, Park replied, and Chen felt his stomach drop. 8 months of captivity. Yet Park looked healthier than many active duty officers Chen knew. "I know it's overwhelming at first. The cognitive dissonance is significant." Morrison shifted nervously beside Chen. "Sir, what exactly is this place?" Park smiled with what appeared to be genuine warmth. "That's the question we all ask, son. Come, let me introduce you to some of the others. You'll find the international community here quite remarkable." As they moved through the dining area, Park provided a running commentary that challenged everything Chen thought he knew about prisoner of war facilities. The elderly man with the white beard was Colonel Dmitry Volkov, a Russian submarine commander who had been captured 18 months earlier. The 2 younger men with him were Lieutenant Singh from the Indian Navy and Captain Rodriguez from the Venezuelan Air Force. "Dimitri's teaching a chess masterclass on Tuesday evenings," Park explained casually. "Singh runs a meditation group that meets at dawn on the upper deck. Rodriguez organized our international music night. He's got a voice that can make angels weep." Chun felt the world tilting beneath his feet. "They allow recreational activities?" "Allow?" Park laughed, but not unkindly. "Colonel, they encourage them. The Americans have a theory that maintaining mental and physical health among prisoners serves everyone's interests. Healthy prisoners cause fewer problems, require less medical care, and, when eventually released, carry more positive associations with their experience." The explanation made strategic sense, yet Chin couldn't shake his unease. This level of consideration went far beyond minimal compliance with international law. It suggested either an elaborate psychological operation or, and this possibility disturbed a more genuine humanitarian concern. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of dinner service, and Chin experienced yet another shock to his system. Rather than the prison slop he had anticipated, the meal being served rivaled what he might find at a quality hotel. Grilled fish with herb seasoning, rice pilaf, fresh vegetables that had obviously been prepared with care, and bread that was still warm from the oven. The kitchen staff includes several prisoners, Park mentioned, noticing Chen's expression. Volkal was actually a chef before he joined the Navy. The Americans were happy to let him help design menus that accommodate different cultural preferences. Chun took a tentative bite of the fish and couldn't suppress a small sound of approval. It was genuinely delicious, not just edible, but expertly prepared. "How is this possible?" he asked, more to himself than to Park. "That's what we all wondered initially," said a new voice. Chin looked up to see Commander Martinez approaching their table, her expression friendly but professionally respectful. "May I join you for a moment?" Chin nodded, his military courtesy overriding his confusion. "I imagine you're experiencing some disorientation," Martinez said, settling into an empty chair. "Every prisoner goes through this adjustment period. You were prepared for mistreatment, and instead you're encountering what probably feels like hospitality." Chun appreciated her directness. "It's unexpected. Our approach is based on decades of research into effective prisoner management," Martinez explained. "When people's basic needs are met, when they feel safe, comfortable, and respected, they're more likely to follow regulations, less likely to attempt escape or cause disruptions, and generally healthier both physically and mentally." "And when they're released?" Chin asked carefully. Martinez's smile was knowing. "When they're released, they carry with them a more complex understanding of their former enemies. They've experienced American values in action, not just American propaganda. Whether that changes their political views is up to them, but it certainly changes their human understanding." It was exactly what Chen's training had prepared him for, the strategic application of humanitarian treatment for long-term political benefit. Yet something in Martinez's manner suggested this wasn't purely calculated manipulation. She seemed genuinely invested in the prisoner's well-being. "The accommodations," Chin ventured, "they're quite comprehensive." "The ship was specifically designed for this purpose," Martinez said. "We learned from earlier experiences that traditional prison ship conditions were counterproductive. High suicide rates, constant medical emergencies, escape attempts that endanger both prisoners and crew. It was inefficient and ultimately inhumane." As if on cue, an announcement came over the ship's intercom. "Evening recreational activities begin in 30 minutes. Tonight's movie screening will be The Bridge on the River Kwai in the main lounge. The reading group discussing Tolstoy meets in Library Room B. Table tennis tournament brackets are posted near the gym entrance." Chun stared at Martinez. "Movies? Carefully selected for educational value," she replied. "Though I'll admit tonight's choice might be particularly relevant to your current situation." Morrison laughed despite himself, actually laughed, and Chin felt another piece of his worldview shift. When had he last seen the young soldier smile? After Martinez excused herself, Chin sat in contemplative silence, picking at his excellent dinner while processing everything he had observed. Around him, the mess hall buzzed with conversation in multiple languages. Prisoners moved freely between tables, engaged in discussions that ranged from philosophical debates to friendly arguments about sports teams from their home countries. "It's not what you expected, is it?" Park said gently. Chin shook his head. "In my training, we learned about American psychological warfare techniques. This fits the theoretical framework perfectly. Comfort used to lower psychological defenses, apparent kindness designed to create cognitive dissonance and eventual cooperation." "Yes," Park agreed. "That's exactly what this is. The question becomes, does understanding the strategy make it less effective?" Chin looked around the room again, taking in the genuine laughter, the obvious health and well-being of long-term prisoners, the absence of fear or desperation that he associated with captivity. "I don't know," he admitted. "Neither did I," Park said. 8 months later, I still don't know. But I've learned something interesting. It's possible for something to be both a strategic manipulation and a genuine expression of human decency. The Americans aren't kind to us despite their strategic interests. They've aligned their strategic interests with their humanitarian values. That evening, as Chin lay in his comfortable bed, listening to the gentle sound of waves against the ship's hull, he stared out his window at stars that seemed impossibly bright against the dark Pacific sky. Everything he had experienced contradicted his expectations, while simultaneously confirming his training. The floating hotel was real. The comfort was genuine. The respect was apparent. And yet it was also exactly what he'd been taught to expect from sophisticated American psychological warfare. The most unsettling realization was that both things could be true simultaneously. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where your expectations were completely overturned by reality? When has someone surprised you by treating you far better than you anticipated? Consider sharing a time when preconceived notions gave way to unexpected kindness, and how that experience changed your perspective. 3 weeks into his stay aboard the USS Sanctuary, Chin received a letter that shattered his understanding of contrast. The correspondence came through official channels from his own government's prisoner exchange office, and its contents left him staring at the pages in disbelief. Lieutenant Morrison, captured alongside Chun, had a brother serving in Chen's home country's military forces. That brother had been taken prisoner just 2 weeks after Chen's own capture, and was now being held in a facility that Chun himself had inspected and approved just 6 months earlier. The letter, written by Morrison's brother through official prisoner correspondence protocols, described conditions that made Chen's stomach turn. Concrete cells with no windows. 1 meal per day consisting of thin soup and stale bread. No recreational activities. No books. No contact with other prisoners, except during brief exercise periods in a walled courtyard that saw sunlight for only 3 hours each day. Chun read the letter twice, then looked up at Morrison, who was sitting across from him in the ship's library. The young soldier was absorbed in a novel he had borrowed from the extensive collection, occasionally pausing to make notes in a journal the Americans had provided. Natural light streamed through large windows, illuminating the comfortable reading chairs and polished wooden tables that wouldn't have looked out of place in an upscale university library. Morrison, Chin said quietly. The young man looked up with a relaxed expression that had replaced his initial terror weeks ago. Yes, Colonel? Chin handed him the letter. This is from your brother. As Morrison read, Chin watched the color drain from his face. The transformation was painful to witness. The gradual return of fear, guilt, and confusion that their comfortable captivity had temporarily erased. My brother is being held like this while I'm living like... Morrison gestured around the library, his voice breaking. Like a guest at a resort, Chin finished grimly. The irony was brutal and inescapable. Chen's own military doctrine, shaped by decades of strategic thinking and resource limitations, treated prisoners according to minimal international standards. Basic food, basic shelter, basic medical care. Nothing more, because resources were limited and prisoners were, ultimately, enemies. The American, by contrast, had invested enormous resources in creating facilities that prioritized prisoner welfare alongside security. The USS Sanctuary represented millions of dollars in design, construction, and operational costs that served no purpose beyond maintaining prisoners in comfort and dignity. Why? Morrison asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why are they treating us so well when we wouldn't do the same? Chin thought, but didn't say. That evening, Chin sought out Commander Martinez. He found her in her office, reviewing reports under warm lighting that made the space feel more like a civilian administrator's office than a military command center. The contrast in treatment standards, Chin said, without preamble. Is it intentional? Martinez looked up from her paperwork, her expression thoughtful. You mean between how we treat prisoners and how other nations do? Chin nodded. It's not about superiority, Colonel. Martinez said carefully. Different nations have different resources, different philosophical approaches, different strategic priorities. We've chosen to invest heavily in prisoner welfare because our research suggests it serves multiple purposes, humanitarian, strategic, and practical, at enormous cost. Yes, but we've calculated that the long-term benefits justify the expense. Healthier prisoners, fewer security incidents, better intelligence cooperation, and, eventually, former enemies will return home with a more nuanced understanding of American values. Chun felt the weight of the paradox settling over him. His country's approach wasn't cruel. It was pragmatic, efficient, focused on essential needs within limited resources. America's approach was luxurious by comparison, but it served strategic purposes that his country's leadership either couldn't afford or didn't prioritize. Neither approach was inherently right or wrong. They reflected different capabilities, different strategic calculations, different cultural values about the treatment of enemies. But sitting in the comfortable library where Morrison was now crying over his brother's letter, Chin couldn't escape the human reality of that strategic difference. Call to action. How do you reconcile conflicting approaches to the same problem when both seem logically justified from their respective perspectives? Share your thoughts on how different resources and priorities can lead to vastly different but equally valid solutions. 6 months later, Chin stood on the dock of his homeland's naval base, breathing air that should have felt like freedom, but instead carried the weight of profound disorientation. The USS Sanctuary had become a distant speck on the horizon, taking with it the most confusing chapter of his military career. The debriefing sessions began immediately. Intelligence officers wanted every detail about American facilities, psychological warfare techniques, and potential strategic intelligence he might have gathered. Chin answered their questions with military precision, but found himself struggling to convey the complexity of what he had experienced. The conditions were designed to create dependency and gratitude, he reported, repeating the analysis his training had provided. Excellent food, comfortable accommodations, recreational activities, all calculated to lower psychological resistance and generate positive associations with American treatment. His commanding officer nodded approvingly. Classic psychological manipulation. Did you observe any prisoners succumbing to these tactics? Chin hesitated. He thought of Colonel Volkov teaching chess, of Lieutenant Singh's morning meditations, of Morrison's transformation from terrified boy to confident young man. Some prisoners appeared to develop positive relationships with their captors, he said carefully. What he didn't report was his own transformation. How could he explain that he had come to respect Commander Martinez's genuine professionalism? How could he describe the cognitive dissonance of experiencing sincere kindness from people he had been trained to see as strategic opponents? The reunion with his family was bittersweet. His wife and children embraced him with tears of joy, grateful for his safe return. Yet Chin felt like he was viewing the scene from outside himself, as if part of him remained aboard that floating paradox in international waters. Weeks passed. Chin returned to his duties, resumed his normal routine, attempted to reintegrate into the life he had left behind. But the experience had left him with questions that military doctrine couldn't answer. Late at night, he would find himself remembering conversations with fellow prisoners, men from different nations, different ideologies, all united by their shared experience of unexpected humanity from their captors. The international community that had formed aboard the USS Sanctuary had been more diverse and intellectually stimulating than many diplomatic conferences he had attended. The most haunting realization was that the American strategy had worked exactly as intended, not because it had broken his loyalty to his country, but because it had complicated his understanding of loyalty itself. He remained committed to his nation's interests, but he could no longer view America as a monolithic enemy. The individuals who had held him captive were patriots, serving their country's interests just as he served his. They were neither demons nor angels, but human beings operated within their own complex moral and strategic framework. Morrison's brother had eventually been released through prisoner exchange, and Chun had personally ensured the young man received medical care and counseling. The contrast between their experiences would forever serve as a reminder of how different approaches to the same challenge could yield vastly different human outcomes. Chin never spoke publicly about the floating hotels that challenged everything he thought he knew about captivity. But in quiet moments with trusted colleagues, he would sometimes observe that the most dangerous enemies weren't those who treated you badly. They were easy to hate. The most dangerous were those who treated you well while remaining your adversary, because they force you to confront the humanity that exists even in conflict. The greatest victory, Chin had come to understand, wasn't in defeating your enemy. It was in surviving the encounter with your humanity intact. Call to action. Have you ever experienced something that fundamentally changed how you view former adversaries or competitors? How do we maintain our principles while acknowledging the complexity and humanity of those who oppose us? Share your thoughts on finding balance between loyalty and understanding.